This conference will now be recorded.
All right, welcome everybody. So good to see you. We got like a little bit of a bigger crowd than last time. People are coming out of their COVID shells. This is our last faculty learning community of the year, but even with the QEP winding down, we will be continuing faculty learning communities next year and in the future. So we're always open to suggestions on topics you're interested in or anything like that, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Charles.
So, thanks for coming out, and it's nice to see people. It's nice to be in space. I haven't seen Kurt in like 6 years.
Hey, I grew up here.
Yeah.
It's in honor of you since we saw each other.
The first thing, so this little talk is going to be about reflection writing. It's something I use in class a lot. It's something I do personally a lot, and I thought it might be something to be helpful because I see it being helpful with students. And I just sort of came across something yesterday that I'm going to talk about toward the end of this that I'm finding really helpful and sort of eye-opening with students, because we're doing, in the class I'm doing right now, CW 385, which is special topics in creative writing. They're doing blog writing, and they're having to write on schedule, and they're having to post twice a week, and they're having to write articles. It's just a ton of writing, but their blogs are really reflective. So I want to read some of their stuff at the end of sort of what's emerging from this, because I thought it would be really good evidence as to why this seems to be an effective type of writing or effective type of exercise. The first thing that I want to do with this is have you all do a little reflection exercise. I just wrote up their context. The context for this is it's a reflection, it's an exercise that I do in class for note-taking and for reflection and for sort of figuring out mile markers or signposts along the way. So the way this works is we'll go through it twice. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to read a list of words. I've got 20 words, and I'm going to read through these, and I just want you to listen to them. And as I read through them, make as many connections as you can with these words that I'm reading. And I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. You should also get a pen or a pencil, because later on we're going to write something down. So I'll start with this, 20 words. Just think about these, but don't write them. Twilight, protect, refer, elephant, relinquish, glove, psychology, beat, adjust, choke, chew, enter, wake, variable, perception, convert, nightmare, destruction, detector, horseshoe. So, without writing these down, just thinking about these, can you give me some connections between these words? It can be anything, just you seeing them connected some way. It could be a story that you made with them, anything. Just from hearing it, as best you can, and there's no wrong answers.
I thought of a safari
Okay.
for the
How come?
first 10 words.
For the first 10 words, okay.
Yeah, there was elephant, and then there were other things that seemed connected to safari, but I can't remember.
Okay.
I'm feeling an IQ test right now.
No, you're not at all. Other stuff.
Me, it started off with home, and then in the middle, I was right in the middle, there was a joke, I remember in the middle, which was the climax of it, and then at the end, there was this, without looking at the words, there was a little bit more, but not as much. It had a slope down, but still more of the slope. It had a flow to it almost.
Okay.
It started off peaceful though.
Other words?
I couldn't help but myself to think of a Albert Camus novel with you convert, perception, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Sorry, that's over intellectualizing it. But
Yeah. Well, maybe not. Okay, so thank you. So this time, if you would, I want to reread these words, and I would like you to write them down as I do. So, twilight, protect, refer, elephant, relinquish, glove, psychology, beat,
Like the vegetable.
either way,
Either way.
adjust, choke, chew, enter, wake, variable, perception, convert, nightmare, destruction, detector, horseshoe. Okay, so now take a minute and try and make as many connections between these as you can in whatever way that you see fit. So, connections between these, ideas,
Still see a woman being attacked. I don't know why. This is like a psychology. The protect and see the woman at twilight and feeling these protections, and then the elephant is like her vision of like packaging like the fear and then psychology, and then I see the climax again of the choke and the chew and all of that violence, and then the nightmare, and then destruction, and then.
oh, wow, okay.
But this is just her perception.
Sure.
Right. But and I come from a forensic background.
Yeah, okay, it's probably, yeah.
Perception, there you go.
Others,
Vision of like a Persian war.
Persian War.
With the elephants attacking, variables of nightmare, destruction, horseshoes, things flying in the air.
Yeah.
That type of thing.
Okay, great. Others.
I was beginning to get it. Yeah, it was hard for me.
I just had this idea of darkness, I don't know, like darkness, when you said relinquish, I thought you're giving up the light, you're relinquishing the light, and several things, I don't know where the elephant fits, but a lot of the other words made me think about darkness and nighttime.
So the reason I use this in class is because what I noticed was that students don't write things down most of the time. And so I always use it on day one because I'm like, you're experiencing so many things throughout the day from internal and external stimuli that you're losing massive amounts of memory because you're just going through so much. And so what we do in class is we talk about like, here's why it's important to write things down that are important, because without writing things down, they don't become tangible, and it makes it much more difficult to make connection between intangibles. So the list is just a random, like literally a randomly generated list of words words, but the idea is that we just see more than 20 things and experience more than 20 things a day, and 90, probably some percent of those things disappear from our minds forever. And so that's sort of what reflective writing does, is it allows us to take those experiences, put them on the page so that we can look back on them later to form those connections. So the definition that I have for reflective writing probably isn't a great definition because I just wrote it last week, but reflective writing is about forming connections between self, exercise, and experience and using those connections as markers and points of interest along the journey of discovery. That's what I think of reflective writing as, is this tool to better understand me and people in the world and experience and how to make those connections and to make those connections real, because I forget basically everything. Not everything, but I forget a lot of stuff. The sheet that I gave you is a handout. It's from the Writing Center. I took it from them, but I wrote it several years ago. And it sort of like gives a primer as to what reflection writing is. And so I want to go through that real quick. I'm not going to go through the whole sheet, but I just want to give you a good idea of sort of what I'm talking about here. So reflection writing, your personal response to experience, events, new information. It's the phase where you process new stimuli in order to think and learn. There's a good quote from here from Donald Schoen who says, through reflection, the practitioner can surface and criticize the tacit understandings that have grown up around the repetitive experiences of a specialized practice and can make new sense of the situations of uncertainty or uniqueness which they may allow themselves to experience. So reflective writing can be a bunch of different types of things. It can be your response to experiences, opinions, thoughts, feelings, way of exploring learning, an opportunity to gain self-knowledge, way to achieve clarity, a chance to develop and reinforce writing skills, a way of making meaning out of what you've studied. What reflective writing is not is just conveying information, it's just description, just pure description, straightforward decision making or judgment, problem solving, simple problem solving, summary or course notes, or an essay. That's not really reflection writing. And then I put some different types of reflective writing on there, journaling, diaries, logbooks, reflective note-taking, essays, diary essays, peer review, self-assessment, and that sort of thing. I think there's another good quote on here from the same book. That book's called The Reflective Practitioner, How Professionals Think and Action. As writers, students have less tacit understanding of how to construct text generally and much less tacit understanding of how to construct text in their new content disciplines. Thus, the first major contribution of reflective writing for students as writers is that such work allows student writers to examine their tacit understandings to see where and how those might be elaborated for the complex or uncertain rhetorical context they write within. That's so like, feels so like Jamesian, circumlocutus or something. Basically, I want to like give a foundation of what I think the benefits of reflective writing are. So I think it helps students identify their knowledge as well as their gaps in that knowledge. It brings to the surface rhetorical and writing process decisions that can focus subsequent revision of learning. It encourages growth as a professional, as a working professional. So part of this lecture, I guess, or this talk is about like writing about writing, but I think like reflective writing is also important to do, not just about writing itself, but just about like reflecting on everything, like on action, on experience, on interactions, on thoughts, or on the work that we're doing, or the work that students are doing. So additional benefits of reflection writing. And I put a note here, this is important because focusing on simply making writing stronger is not important to many students, and finding the tie-in as to how it can benefit them in their discipline is the element that gives their action purpose. I think about this all the time. There's so many students, like especially like in first year writing classes, where they're not going to be writers, they don't care about writing, they're only doing it because they have to. And so for me, it's sort of like this struggle, and I'm trying to learn constantly, and I still am, like, how do I get them interested in this thing that they don't care about? How do I get them to tie this in? And I know we're all like sort of on the same page with that. So one of the things I try and do is get them to understand processes outside of writing. So if they're playing sports, or if they're studying nursing, or if they're going into some specific discipline where they feel that the writing isn't going to be like this big thing, to get them to reflect on how they're going to use their knowledge of process and whatever that discipline is, so that they can have something that they connect to in a class that they don't feel is related to their discipline. Reflection on the event to gain greater awareness of self and others. That exercise that we did in here, I actually built it because I was working with Amy Young's doctoral class, and we were trying to figure out ways to like make those connections. But in that class, there was a lot of talk about awareness of self and others, keeping logs in psychology so that you can see where you were. These markers, marker of growth, where you were and where you are in comparison. I tell my class this all the time, like, I'm not holding you up to this level of you need to be like here. I'm looking at where you're growing as you're moving through this thing. Where did you start? Where are you at now? And I think that like reflection writing is a great way to do that, because it allows you to look back and you have this very tangible marker of here's where I was a year ago. Here's how I was thinking about things a year ago. And here's where I am now. And it's sort of this confidence builder of like, you know what? I do have growth. I am getting better at this. I always think of it as like watching hair grow. It's like watching my beard grow. It's like I'll wake up one morning and my wife's like, you need to cut your beard. And I'm like, it did get really big. And then I'll look at a picture of it like 4 months ago, and it's like, my beard was just like super short. But you don't notice the growth as it's happening. And the same thing happens, I think, in the classroom. So confidence, that element to tangibly show growth. A tool to trigger memory. Same thing with what we did with the list. We lose massive amounts of memory experience because we are under constant bombardment from internal and external stimuli. We're just losing that stuff. So oftentimes I feel like I have these like, it seems like it happens like right in the morning or at night, and I have this awesome thought about this really great idea, and then it's gone, and then it's just like gone for good. There's this episode of The Simpsons where Homer's having this dream, and he's presenting to this boardroom, and he has this object in his hand, and he's like, this device is going to change the world. And before he can open his hand, he wakes up, and that's what I always think of as like that feeling of like, oh man, I had that thing, and it was going to be the thing that lets me retire. So some practical stuff on this. Getting students to practice this type of writing. Because this might be something that folks are interested in. So reflective writing as an assignment. I use that in class, where usually in the first year, well, in creative writing classes, I use it all the time, but in like first year 109 and 110, to get them to reflect on something that they've written.
Can I ask you a favor? Is there a way you can make that font bigger?
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Perfect.
Where are we at here? Okay. So, so reflective writing as an assignment into itself. Generally in 109 or 110, they're writing different types, different modes of writing, and then I'll have them do a reflective writing assignment at the end of the class to look back on what they've done over the previous 5 weeks to see how they've entered into this process, what they've learned, obstacles that they've overcome, things that they faced, that sort of thing, so that they get this sort of practice of thinking about, of writing about writing and thinking about writing, as opposed to just writing something that I'm having them write. Integration into existing assignments. So writing a paper and then a low stakes follow-up paper about writing that paper. I use that sometimes too, where they don't have an actual like full length essay. It's just, here's this like short paper. I want you to write like several paragraphs about your experience writing about this thing. I'm super heavy on process, like understanding of process. So I often have them write about their process. Like, how did you enter into this? Like, what were problems that you pinpointed in your work? How did you identify those problems? How do you plan to overcome those, or how do you plan to face those in the future? That type of reflection writing. Also, when I'm up here, if you all want to jump in and stuff, feel free to. Like, totally fine. You don't have to just let me go the whole time. I usually provide criteria to guide their approach instead of just being like, write about this. I'll be like asking them questions, giving them prompts to sort of guide them so that they're just not all over the place. I found that like too much freedom like feels overwhelming to them. I always want to just be like, write whatever you want. Everybody's like shutting down. So I create a series of questions or guides to like help them with the writing, and then usually that's focused on process, experience, and their takeaway from the assignment or from whatever it was they wrote. Contextual information as to the importance of this type of writing. So what I try to do is figure out what their major is, and then try to, when I give them feedback, try to apply that feedback to whatever their discipline is. So if they're studying science or if they're studying, I don't know, whatever it is, my feedback is sort of geared to them to show that connection between their reflection, the type of writing that they're doing, understanding the process, and how that relates to that specific discipline that they're studying. Are the students going to need this for careers in their fields? Even if it isn't career mandatory, how can this type of writing be helpful to them? I try and point that out to them as much as possible to show them why this is beneficial. Even on just like a basic relationship level of like, I had this boyfriend and this girlfriend and now my relationships failed and I wrote down these poems about it. That's super helpful. It's a type of reflective writing so that maybe I don't repeat those same mistakes in my next relationship. Creating that context so that they are in an intensive writing course, they can see the connection between their discipline and the exercise of writing. I know I'm going through this super fast. So, like I mentioned before, in the class I'm doing right now, we're doing blog writing. And it's really, they can do their blogs about whatever they want, but almost everybody in the class is doing very personal stuff. I guess I can pull those up, but I'm not going to. So they're doing reflective writing that's public facing. And I think there's like a bunch of different types of writing. Reflective writing, of course, there's like journals where they ask one day in class, what's the difference between a journal and a blog? And, you know, journals generally are pretty private. Most of the time, you don't read somebody's journal until they're after they're dead or something, or if they, I guess they can put it out. But generally, journals are for us to reflect on. Whereas a blog, and many of the students, we'll talk about in a minute, but many of them are writing for themselves, but they're writing to a public audience. And it's coming through in this reflection, and they're like sort of gaining these insights into these pieces of who they are and where they're going. So writing for the public purpose, not just writing for an instructor, I think that is a huge thing that I keep thinking about constantly. Like in my classes, the students, why am I having them do this work? Am I doing this work with them just so that they can like jump through a hoop for me and get a grade? Or am I giving them something that has multiple levels that they're able to pull from, pull experience from, pull process from, and then pull practice from? And I keep thinking about that. So that was the whole reason I wanted to do blogs, because I was like, if you establish a blog, you get this practice of this type of writing, and I can have them do a bunch of different modes of writing in a blog. So they can write about like reviews, they can write about interviews, they can write about top 5 lists or lists, and then they have the choice of stuff that they want to write about as well. But it gives them this option to, or this ability to write about through different modes, and it serves as a portfolio, and it's something that they're not just writing for me, it's a whole audience. So while they're writing these blogs, they're all commenting on each other's blogs as well. They're building up readers, and they have people coming in to see their work. So it's not just, here's a paper, here's this reflection piece, turn it into your instructor, and then the instructor is like, hey, that was really great. I don't mean to like make it sound like that, but I wanted them to have an audience, so it feels like what they're doing has weight, is what it is. So their blog writing does a bunch of different things. There's a purpose to it. They're not just writing for me. It serves as a portfolio. Now, these are writing students. Shows their recent work, and it shows their work ethic and perseverance, perhaps without tangible or noticeable reward. I always talk to them about that. It's like everything doesn't have that instant reward. Like some things you're just going to have a bunch of private victories because you've done this. When you're watching like American, like what is it, like American Idol or any of those shows where you see these people and they're performing and these celebrities and they're performing, all you get to see is that tip of the iceberg. You don't actually see all the hundreds of thousands of hours or whatever that they put in to get to that point. But I want them to have something where the tip of the iceberg is readily exposed so it doesn't feel like I have to do everything in the shadow, everything by myself. And I just think it's a particular type of reflective writing that I found over the last 5 weeks that the students seem to really be gravitating toward because it feels like to them that it has substance and that they're writing for a purpose. And I think that's really what reflective writing should do, is that it should serve a purpose. It should be this connective tissue between the person and their understanding of whatever it is that they're exploring. So what students are observing in their reflective writing, I asked them about this, and this list is compiled from the stuff that they told me. So they're posting these blogs twice a week. And like I said, these are sort of external facing, so they're writing for the public. But these are some things that they came up with. They told me it's easier to illustrate a point that connects to people. They see themes emerging, and most of the time they see unexpected themes emerge from their work. For example, they're writing about like, somebody's writing about sports in class, and then they notice this theme of anxiety appearing in their posts that they hadn't even thought of before. And then they started to find these connections between these posts about sports and then this theme of anxiety and how these things were sort of linked, and they were seeing it over the last few weeks. They see the emergence of humor and trauma. So a lot of them have these humorous posts that are also like posts about trauma that they've experienced. And there's things existing side by side. One of the things that they're noticing is their consistency of voice, and they're having to be aware of this as they're doing this type of writing, where they're constantly thinking about how does my voice sound? What is the tone? How are these posts connected? Because they're not just doing it once. They're doing it multiple times. It's this constant thing that they're having to enter into. And I think that's a huge point that I just sort of thought about this morning, is that so many times in like my first year writing courses, I'm just like, hey, do this reflective writing paper. And it's just this one-off thing. And I didn't get to see all of this sort of emerge from that, but I have been able to see this emerge through their consistency in doing this type of writing. So I think that part of reflective writing, because when you keep a journal or a diary, you're sort of writing in there daily, or you've sort of got like a schedule that you're putting stuff in there. That's very different than like in my 109 where I'm like, now write a reflection paper. That's even a very different type of reflection writing. So I think it's important to sort of be aware of that, at least for me to be aware of that. And like I said, I'm like learning as I'm going through all this stuff. Some of what they're finding is that they're creating characters, themselves as characters, and they're writing. Some of them are writing through themselves, and some of them are writing through character. So this writing through me, that's where they, like, part of the class felt like they were writing through themselves as they were doing these reflective pieces. And they've come up with like awareness of themes about themselves, finding ways to make things okay and looking for silver linings. Therapeutic writing, looking at emotions through an experience and accept those emotions and experience to make sense of them. The further within, somebody said, the further within I can go, the farther I can expand outward to be aware of the experience of others and how they correlate to my experience. I thought that's awesome. Writing through character. So some of them have sort of detached themselves to some degree from the writing that they're doing. They said writing through character helps me find empathy and exploration of others, helps me remove my personal identity to look at myself with empathy. Easier to connect with self because I'm given the space to look through things more objectively. Like a conversation is happening, like I'm giving past self advice, like I can consume the voice and the content that I create. I don't think you have to be doing blog writing to get this. I think you need to be doing consistent reflective writing to get this, because that allows them to see the themes that are emerging from that thing. And I think a one-off, and I keep talking about the one-off because I do that paper in 109, and I'm not going to do it anymore after doing this, because it's totally changed my mind on it. I want them to be doing it constantly. And I know some folks already do that. Some folks have students posting like reflective writing and like Canvas and that sort of thing. And I think that's how you see themes emerge, is through the consistency of that practice. Writing through me and through characters. So some of them felt like they were like doing both things, trying to put myself in a character's position. Some of them are posting poems that they're using, and they're posting these poems, and then they're going through and they're talking about like how they built the poem or what the poem means or the context for the poem. All of this is just incredibly reflective of their experience and what they're going through and what they're seeing and observing daily. Seeing a reflection of myself, me at the end of the day. I can only understand myself, trying to define myself, come to an understanding. Less pressure to live up to others' expectations. They said that writing, like this reflective writing, is writing for me. At the end of the day, it's just mine. And I think that's a big thing too. That goes back to that low stakes writing assignment of, honestly, with these assignments, a lot of them, I just take the grade off the table. And it's like, you know what, if you turn it in, it's the link. If you turn it in on time, you get full credit for it. And what it does is it allows them to go in and take chances and write about whatever the hell they want to write about. And I think they appreciate that, but I also think it does that thing of, it's just mine, it belongs to me. I think that's super important for emerging writers, emerging thinkers. We're all emerging thinkers, I guess.
And Charles, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
When students do that, do you think they try harder? I mean, do you think they have, because I love that idea. Do they think that they, since it's writing for themselves, they put more into it? Have you seen that? Or?
I think, so before I did this, not just this, but before I did that sort of ungrading sort of thing, what I read was that when the grade is sort of taken off the table, and it's not taken off the table, they still get a grade. They still have to show up and do the work and everything. But they take more chances because they feel like, well, I'm not going to be penalized if I do something and it fails, or if I'm going to talk about something that the instructor doesn't agree with. And they seem to feel like they have more freedom to explore, and that's sort of been my experience with it. And that's what sort of what a lot of the research showed too that I looked at that was talking about ungrading. Some of them were surprised by unintended humor. They saw that emerging from their writing. They were writing about serious stuff, and then they were like, I'm actually using this like humorous voice in here. Some of them were surprised by their authenticity. I have a student who was writing like heavily about sports and was writing about sports early on, very distant, like here's this game that took place, because they want to be a sports writer. But the last few posts have been incredibly like intimate posts of this person and their experience with family members and death and loneliness and things like that. So they mentioned they're surprised by their authenticity, they're surprised by their vulnerability. They didn't think they were going to be writing like that. Writing about experience, authentic experience through a voice that I don't have to filter. That's sort of getting back to that idea. They don't have to filter. I don't care what they write. I just want them to be writing and thinking about writing and writing about writing is what I want them to do.
Charles, what kind of feedback are you giving as a faculty throughout the process? Because it seems like in order to do that, you have to have created a certain amount of trust with them. So I'm wondering if you're giving feedback through the process, what that looks like.
So for their blog posts, they're giving each other feedback in comments. Every Monday in class, they get up and then they talk about their posts. They have to present them, and then they talk about, and then we have a dialogue. And then on all of their posts, I give them written feedback on everything. Some of it's on content, some of it's on the aesthetics of what the blog looked like. But it's really about them trying to, most of my feedback is them entering into spaces that they're comfortable with. That's the big thing too, is that They have to be comfortable. I'm not going to be like, hey, you need to be more vulnerable and talk about your mom and whatever. They really have to get to that point on their own. And that student did. Like, it wasn't anything of me being like, hey, stop talking about baseball so much. You need to talk more about your family. It was really, they mentioned in class today, they were inspired by other people in class. So I think it's the constant dialogue in class that creates like a comfortable space for them to start doing that and sharing those reflections.
So it's almost like you're reflecting on their progress. Almost.
Yeah,
You know,
they're,
if you're seeing what you've done and you're opening that up to reflection.
and it's constant. So every Monday, they're showing how their blog is evolving, maybe aesthetically. They're showing how they're writing. They're showing their content, how that's evolving. They talk about what they've been thinking about, and they're super encouraging. They clap for each other. They comment on each other's blogs when they do that. And it's really sort of a cool experience because you're just sitting in a classroom and you're listening to people reflect on their experience, and other people like support them and encourage them.
What's your take on their vocabulary as they get deeper into this?
As far as
In terms of just their maturation as writers. I mean, I know writing begets writing, and for me, I'm just thinking, writing in and of itself is a virtue in and of itself that you don't really come to that until you've done a lot of it. But I'm just curious about, given that, I was thinking about my own college experience 35, 40 years ago, where there were 3 books on a certain topic in the whole library. Now these students have millions of pieces of information on that topic.
Yeah.
And it's overwhelming, to your point, but I'm just curious about how they grow in their ability to actually express themselves with vocabulary, or is that a pointy-headed kind of geeky academic way to describe it or understand it?
no, I think so. I think that's one of those like mini heads of that Hydra or something of them noticing themes that are emerging. Like they say things like that of like when they're presenting, they're like, oh, I use this word like 3 times in this paragraph. They come to those like realizations of that stuff. And also they see those themes emerging, not just in their content, but also in like how they're putting things on the page and how they're like placing it on the page physically. Like,
So they're becoming cognizant of that. They're becoming smarter as they go through this process, and that's a good thing.
I think so. I think they're becoming more aware
Yeah, that's a better way to put
of
it. Yeah.
where they are, how they're emerging, and like what their goals are, what it is that they need from that process.
Right.
I don't want to speak for them, but like that's sort of what I've been seeing through this type of thing.
I was just gonna comment, I also feel like the more they write, the more comfortable they are with writing and like the longer, works they can produce in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah.
It's like the practice of doing it, and creating that sense of comfort around it, I think can release a lot of people's anxieties around writing and unlock some potential that they have.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that yeah, absolutely. I think that this constantly of having to produce, where I got part of the idea from was I was talking to Matt Walsh over in the art department, and he has this assignment where the students for their first assignment, they have to do 500 drawings. And it can be anything. It can just be like, here's a skull, or like, here's 50 different skulls, or whatever. But I was thinking like, I love that idea of just making them get in there and start doing stuff that feels like it has purpose and weight and gravity. So they have to post at least 500 words twice a week for these blogs. And in addition to that, they have to pick out a website and they have to write an article with the intent of having it published. But that's besides this thing right here, this reflective writing that they're doing. So what I've seen is that they're sort of having to learn to be consistent. They're having to create constantly. They're having to revise constantly because the work that they're putting out is being seen by others. It's not just something that can sit and they just revise and revise and revise until it's like, they've lost passion for that project. They're having to give feedback to other people. They're having to be aware of voice and tone. They're having to be aware of audience. They're having to find connection between all of the different types of writing that they're doing as they're posting these things. So I think that, like, at least from my experience with this, it feels like they're making a bunch of connections and that there's a bunch of different layers to this type of writing that has allowed them to just go from, well, I've got to write this essay to, I'm going to write whatever I want to write about, but this thing that I'm writing about has like meaning to me, and it has weight for me. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. And I talked the whole time, but I'm glad you all jumped in. Approaches to reflective writing. So I'd like to know if you do use writing, maybe how you use it, even personally. Reflective writing, maybe why you use it. You already use it in your classroom, why and how are you using it? How can reflective writing be helpful, or is it helpful in your particular, that should probably say discipline? And then how can you implement reflective writing in your classroom if you're not using it? So maybe answering any of these questions, because what I'm trying to do is figure out new ways to do this, not just for myself, but also like to find things that students are connecting to.
I'll tell you something, I started this session, I was worried that people weren't doing the reading, because I have online classes. They weren't doing the reading, they were just jumping straight to the application, their assignments. And so I've added an assignment as an annotated bit. And Leah's got a really nice tutorial on the library website about how to do an annotated bit. It's not, I think, 10 minutes. So I give them the form that they have key points, and then they have to reflect on what they read. And I think based on what you said today, I think at the bottom, I'm going to ask them to take all the things they've read. Each one was kind of shallow and pull it together. You know, what they agreed with, what, you know, because they're all on the same topic. And then what did they agree with, what how do they vary. And the one thing is we had this reflection at the end of every unit for people to go in and say, you know, we call it what's in it for me. We will pull it back to how to help you. And one of the things I've added is, what questions do you still have? You know, all I students have had.
Yeah.
And so, based on this today, I think I'm going to start having them do that within the annotated bit. To say, you know, what else, when you read that, what did you think was missing?
Yeah.
What questions did you have after you read it? And to force them to be more critical in what they're doing with the annotated bits. I've not heard one story complain. I mean, nobody's complained about them.
Yeah.
And I've also told them the whole thing about reflection and why this is so important, and that it's really how we grow, and that this is a way for them to hold on to what they've been reading, so that they can go back and find it easier if they're trying to figure out, you know, or something else. So we use reflection a lot.
Yeah, I think when we saw our assignments and our NPSM effective, which is, I think why our students write so much. I'm always saying, like, our students write so much, and so much of it is tied into personal experience. And what do you know, what you said, what do you still have questions about? And then you leave it open.
The other thing I've been doing on discussions is, you know, the whole thing of read for, you know, watch for other people. Well, on a lot of them, I'll say, I want you to read at least 3 other people, and then I want you to do a separate post back to yourself as to reflecting what the other people said. How does that connect with what you've done? What do you think is, you know, not necessarily because some of those back to each other. You know, so this is a way of, let's talk about what you read from everybody else and how is this.
I think interviews so helpful. Just thinking back to this past week, we talked about substance use disorder and nurses, and you know, how about an experience where now that you've watched the work about the novels from evidence-based resources about substance use disorders, you talk about the experience of what you might have experienced or observed. And when we have students who say, I still haven't ever come into contact with anyone who had that or was suspicious, it's really eye-opening. But I don't have to say that because it's peer reviewed. So you have other students saying, well, did you have anyone who was like perfectionist? Did you have anyone who was, have you ever worked with anyone who was type A? So that's really nice to have that peer review. Right, to have that peer review component there, so that continues the conversation rather than coming from faculty to say, missed the boat. Yeah. Or, not that you missed the boat, but like, don't stop at one line, like, no, I haven't seen it, or no, that hasn't happened to me.
I'm thinking, I'm finishing out our capstone project right now, and at different points we stop and talk about, to some degree, what the process has been like for them and what the writing process is, what they've struggled with or whatever, but I've never had them write a reflection about that, and I think that would be really, really helpful for them. Not only, maybe at some point during the process or multiple points during the process, but also at the end. Since this is their capstone experience, just having them reflect on what am I taking from this, what was the process like for me, what can I take away from that? And so that's something I want to incorporate that I haven't.
Yeah. I think with that, there's no way for them to escape thinking about that process. They have to, excuse me, they have to articulate it. I mean, at least they have to pretend to articulate it, and put it into words. And I don't know how you can fake that. I mean, maybe you can just like, I'm just gonna get done, whatever. I mean, I still think that, like, at least for me, the takeaway is that, oh, I had to think about this thing. How do I apply this to something else? I always try to point that out to them too. But like, you're not just learning one thing here. You're learning, how does this overlap everything in life that you're doing? All right, 12:27. I guess we're out of time.
I have a quick question. Like when you said that on the blog, I think the blog idea is really neat. I remember thinking like in my OT classes, if they created, I don't know how I can make it work, but like your kind of idea of they do an activity achievement, like connecting it back to like how it's really helpful for them moving forward in the program. But you said that they would get feedback from other students. So was that part of like the grade requirement? I know it's not graded, like it's a completion, but did you require them to do that or just have them?
Yeah. So their feedback is they go on their blogs and comment, like a regular blog comment. So their feedback doesn't need to be like, you should have done, it's not like necessarily technical feedback. It's just like you would comment if you read somebody's blog. Like, that's what the feedback's like. It is, they have to comment on at least 2 people's posts every week, and it is a percentage of their grade. Yeah. And then the other piece of feedback is then on Mondays, because they each have to get up and present on Monday, and then they have to go through and show off everything, and then they're supposed to participate in class. They do it anyway, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I definitely think weighting it gives some of those students who are more reluctant to maybe enter into that on their own. It has to be weighted so many times because I think for this particular class, they don't care because it's an upper level. These are mostly juniors and seniors. Everybody in the class is creative writing. And the ones that are really raising the bar really put the pressure on the others. It's like, come on, I'm commenting on your stuff, you better keep commenting too. So that's a nice thing. That's sort of like, what is the term, unicorn?
Yeah.
It's rare, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I'm with you. I mean, I give them all the points as long as they put some effort in. But if they just say, it was a good article, it's like, I've done that.
Yeah.
But as long as they make some effort, and I'll say next time expand more, and but then the next time, because there are not really right or wrong.
And I think we're in a culture that is not reflective, and I would include higher ed in general. We don't have time because of the amounts of information being thrown at us to, I mean, it's a little bit of a cop-out. We need to make time to reflect as professionals, but I think when you see, I remember 30 years ago, we used to be able to sit down, have coffee, and reflect on pedagogical, just like this, and do it 2 or 3 times a week with our colleagues. We don't have time to do that anymore, and I think this is so valuable, Charles, because it forces people to think about how do we get a reflective practicing and reflective culture back. And thank you for the Donald Shane or Schoen book is a great book and speaks to those of us who are social scientists. I mean, that you diagram it like we would do it, but it's also because the humanistic disciplines are more reflective. That's what you guys do, and that's good for all of us, sciences, social sciences, you name it. So thank you, this has been great.
I think writing is right up there with math. You know, as far as don't make me take a math class, don't make me brain class, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so many of them that I've talked to have come into class and they've been like, I don't know, some teacher in 6th grade told them they couldn't write. And
Yeah,
that's the only thing they remember.
That's right.
It was like they were 10 years old and had hammered out of them.
Self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. Exactly.
They're usually the same students, not always, but they are. So in addition to requiring that you respond to students, because almost all of our things are really throughout our curriculum, it's to students who have not been commented on. So that way everyone gets equal distribution. And then one session, I broke them up into groups. And so it was 4 groups, 4 class groups of like 6 students in each group. And so they had to comment on each of theirs. And then once halfway through the session, I jumbled them so that way they could see other people's writings. Because sometimes what they'll have is one student, like I'll choose Charles. I really like Charles's writing, or I just latched on to Charles, and I'll always respond to Charles. So I really, my eyes are not on the rest of the groups. So you can break them up into groups in Canvas, or just assign them groups 1 through 6, and then halfway through the session, okay, you reassign groups 1 through 6. And you're not really keeping tabs on who they're responding to. Like, at least I don't. It's just the thing that, right, hopefully they're beginning to see other people's stuff and quality. And so that they're getting, the students are getting various feedback. We have someone who's a little bit more.
We're trying to also kind of, you know, not to be same old stuff every time.
Right.
Oh, God, you more,
They love that.
Yeah,
I mean, there's like that.
I've gone back and forth with like using discussions and stuff like that. And this year I tried proposal. And I think some students really liked it. And it was, like content-specific articles that I would have them read, and some people would get really engaged and kind of reflective, like connecting into their own lives, and then other people would be like asking like the definition of a word. I'm like, you can literally Google that. Like, why does that mean that? Like,
but then, you know, I mean, but I think that's the point, is that a lot of times people don't know how to comment because they've not engaged.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So they don't really know what, like, what do I comment? Well,
Yeah.
and the other thing is to get out of the social media kind of responding. Some of it really ugly. It's kind of, like, to give an example, and this last thing I'll say, I promise. But I was on Facebook the other day and watching this one lady for her recipes. And she was making a spaghetti casserole, and she just broke up the spaghetti, put it in the bottom, put the water in there, did all this, and then baked it. So, that's kind of my kind of cooking. And
no free cooking.
oh my goodness, as you read down, I'm an Italian, this is offensive to me. I'm not Italian grandmother will come out of the grave and hit me. And I'm thinking, just move on. I mean, all of the ugly comments, I'm like, why did you even look at, it's like, I just don't get it.
And you had to take time out of the day to get on that,
Yeah, it's like, my dead grandmother would hit me with a wooden spoon. I'm like, you're kidding me.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
Good to see you.